All right, how's it going, everyone? So what I'm going to cover today is I'm going to cover removal and tear down of a automatic transmission. What we have is we have a 2008 Dodge Ram with a 3.7 liter V6. Truck has around 208,000 miles on it. It is a work truck. That's why it needs a trans overhaul. The trans is tired. We check the fluid level. Fluid level is low, as well as it is fairly burnt on the dipstick. We do have multiple codes for gear ratio errors in first, second, and third. So we more than likely have some burned up clutches inside of the transmission. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull out the transmission and inspect it. I'm going to go over the procedure and the steps in removing the transmission. So our first step, we already removed the dipstick. It's usually important to do to remove the dipstick from the tube so that we don't have an issue with it getting stuck. Our dipstick tube for the transmission's right here. We will have to unbolt that. They do break very easily, especially on these vehicles. Our next step up here is the only other thing we need to do is we need to undo the negative battery cable. And the reason why we're going to undo the negative battery cable is so that when we remove the starter, it won't arc on us. So now that we have the vehicle up in the air, what I like to do is I like to start removing components from the rear of the transmission and then work my way forward. That way you're as thorough as possible in getting everything removed. This is a vehicle that is rear wheel drive, so we have a drive shaft that we have to contend with. It's a two-piece drive shaft, so we have our intermediate bearing and then we have our back U-joint as well as our front U-joint. Usually it's a good idea anytime you remove a drive shaft to mark it against the pinion flange on the rear differential. This way you can get it back in the same orientation. These drive shafts do have a balance that they'll be set to. This way, with a line marked, we're not going to cause an issue that the vehicle didn't have before it came in. All right, so with removing this drive shaft, to actually get access to all of these bolts easily, what I like to do is pop the transmission into neutral. And we can go through and get all the bolts off. All right, you want to come give me a hand real quick? It's always a good idea with these heavy drive shafts to get an extra set of hands. So you don't drop it on your head. Okay, thank you. Another step that I like to do is to prevent the trans fluid from dripping on your head. Just take an old drive shaft yoke, just put it in the back of the transmission. That'll prevent it from dripping on you constantly. We are going to drain the fluid on this before we go to the trans bench, so we'll do that as well, but there is some fluid that's stuck in the back of the extension housing that can be dripping on you the whole time. It gets really annoying after a while. All right, so I'm going to remove the transmission cross member. I have the back of the transmission supported with a pull jack. This will enable the transmission to go up and down by moving the jack up and down. This way we can get the cross member out and then also get a transmission jack under it when the time comes. Okay, so at this point what I like to do is I like to actually drain the transmission. That way when I get it on the bench to overhaul it, I'm not swamped with trans fluid. This transmission already has had a kind of clever repair for a stripped out bolt. Anytime you have an aluminum case, especially with high mileage vehicles, it's really important to clean out all the threads after you do any type of trans service, especially on these silicone sealed pans, because they can hydrolock off the old silicone inside of it and pop all the threads out. So we probably will have to do a couple thread repairs on this particular transmission. I'm going to leave one bolt sort of in to try to catch the pan when it drops down to drain it. That way we don't make as big a mess as normally they are when you have to drop these down. All right, so with the pan removed, we have a lot of clutch material. The magnet doesn't have too much ferrous material on it, so that's usually a good indication that the planetary gear sets haven't come apart. But we definitely have some brass and some aluminum. So potentially we do have a basket or a drum issue, or it's just all junk from the converter. We can drop the filter down and look at what comes out of the filter, and it's fairly metallic. Hopefully this trans is rebuildable. We'll see how it all goes, but yeah, it's looking pretty thick and mushy in there, so I don't have high hopes for this one now. After dropping the pan, still need to remove it, tear it down, inspect it for its damage though. Okay, so at this point the transmission's drained a fair amount. We are gonna tear this down. So what I like to do at this point is put the transmission pan back on it. I've left the filter off because the filter's done. Even if it goes back to a remanufacturer, they don't need the filter. So we've drained as much fluid as we can out. I'm gonna put the pan back on because the transmission is going to sit on the transmission pan with the transmission jack to get it out. So we only have to have a couple bolts in it to just secure it. This way too, we're not leaking any fluid out onto us while we're continuing to remove the transmission from the case. All right, so our next step is we're gonna start to disconnect all the electrical connectors for the valve body, the speed sensors, and the pressure sensors that are external to the vehicle. We've already undone the shift linkage, but we need to remove the shift linkage from its bracket. The only other thing that I don't disconnect at this point is going to be the trans cooler lines, again, to try to mitigate as much of a mess that you're going to create and not have stuff dripping on your head. I leave these connected until I get the last 2 bolts on the bell housing and the transmission's ready to come out of the vehicle. So we'll work on getting all the electrical stuff disconnected at this point, and we'll go from there. All right, with the torque converter inspection plate removed, we can now gain access to our torque converter bolts. This particular vehicle has 4 18mm torque converter bolts that have to be removed. To gain access to all of them, I have a breaker bar on the crankshaft so that I can rotate the crank as I remove them. Usually it's a good idea to always rotate the engine in the direction that the firing order goes. That way you don't run the risk of jumping a timing chain. Not all engines are that type or that sensitive, but usually it's a good idea to practice that just in case. So we'll go through and start removing these. Most of the time these do have a pretty big helping of Loctite, and they can be quite difficult to remove. All right, this is our last torque converter bolt, so it's our 4th one. One of the things to do is once you get to the last one, it's a good idea with still a couple threads, is you push the torque converter back. So you heard that thud. That's the torque converter going back that's disengaged against the flex plate, so now it'll be easier to get it out. The torque converter can get stuck on the hub of the flex plate. Then what can happen is it's really difficult to get the trans out. Potentially the torque converter can stay stuck to it, and you can make a giant mess and potentially have the torque converter fall on you. So setting it back into the case means that we should be disengaged from that and we're all right. So this truck has other issues, needs a catalytic converter. Definitely something to note so that you don't get a recheck when this goes back together. All right, one of the other things that gets often overlooked is removing the transmission vent. They can get ripped. Our next step is going to be going along and taking the top bell housing bolts. Now, up till now, the lower bell housing bolts have been 15mm. Like I said, they're different thread for the top and the bottom. They're also different heads. They're 14mm bolts, which kind of helps in differentiating one from the other. What's really nice to have is a really long extension to be able to get up and reach these, especially on these rear drive transmissions. And then your best friend in the entire world when it comes to this stuff is impact universal joints. These will save your bacon on getting fasteners that are really difficult to get to. transmission dipstick. I'm missing that bolt. Alright, so now we're at the point where we have 2 bell housing bolts left. So I like to disconnect the transmission cooler lines again because these may be kind of messy. Now these are quick release fittings that aren't so quick to release. They do make a special tool that you can put around the line to try to get these out. I never have much luck with them, especially on vehicles that are a little bit older. So typically what I do is I just take a pick and remove the little clover spring that retains these guys, and then put it back when the line is removed. I have better luck getting these in and out this way than using the special tool. All right, so now we'll take the last 2 bell housing bolts, we'll secure the jack up, and we'll be able to remove the transmission from the vehicle. All right, so I have the transmission jack in place with the feet set around the base of the transmission. This is the heaviest section of the transmission. That's where you want the transmission jack to be supporting this. At this point, we can remove our pull jack. Now, you do need to be wary of the engine mounts and what kind of vehicle you're working on. This particular vehicle is a pickup truck that is front engine rear drive. Our engine is supported off of 2 engine mounts. These are plenty adequate to support the engine with the transmission removed. But if it's a front wheel drive vehicle or anything along those lines, you do have to be wary of that. Our next step is we're going to strap the transmission down to the jack. And so you can either do it with chains. I like to use a ratchet strap. One of the things to note though is you want to be wary of fuel lines and electrical. You want to make sure you're going under all of that. The wiring harness for this transmission is going to stay in the truck. We don't want to get caught on it and potentially damage the harness going through. So we want to make sure we're guiding the strap around all of the wire harness and we're not getting it stuck to anything. And then what I typically do is just put it through part of the base of the trans jack. Hook the strap to itself and then ratchet it down. So this is a safety measure so that if anything happens, transmission shifts, vehicle shifts, when it's coming down, you don't run the risk of the transmission falling onto you. So it's just a little bit added insurance to make sure. Some trans jacks will have chains that are guided to here and you just do it to a bell housing bolt or something along those lines. I find the ratchet strap usually works pretty good, whether or not it's front wheel drive or rear wheel drive. So next we got 2 more bolts to remove, and then we can toss this guy out of the car. Okay, so the 2 last bolts that we're gonna remove, there's one on either side. Now the reason why I've left these in is these are the ones that are closest to the dowel pins for the transmission end of the engine. The dowel pins center the transmission against the back of the engine. These are the strongest bolts to support everything. They're the first I reinstall when the transmission is going back in, and they're the last I remove. They are again a different thread pitch and different head size. So we have 15s on the lower bolts, 14s on the tops, and this is a 16 mil. So again, make sure you're keeping track of the fasteners, that they're going back in the right location when the trans goes back in. There you go. Some vehicles do have these separator plates. They're not too big of a deal when removing the transmission. They are a giant pain in the butt when you're reinstalling it. So what you want to make sure is you pull the transmission back far enough to where it's going to clear the flex plate, which we are right here. We also want to make sure that the torque converter is still inside the transmission case itself. And now we can start dropping it down, making sure to be careful to not pull any of the wires, not pitching the trans back. And dropping it out of the vehicle. Okay, so now what we're left with is we're gonna have to tear down this transmission, overhaul it, and see if it's a potential candidate for a good rebuild. All right, so we have our transmission overhauled and ready to go back in. The main fail point on this transmission was a torque converter failure. We basically had to replace some of the clutches because they were a little hot, and the seals, and clean out the internal clutch material that had gotten everywhere. This is a warranty job, so you don't go completely through everything in the transmission. They just want you to do what the failed component is. It's pretty much ready to go back in the truck. Some of the things to prep before we actually put it back in is we do want to make sure the 2 dowel pins are in place. When we remove the transmission, this dowel pin did fall out. So this is back installed, and we have the separator plate also secured and ready to go. These can fall and fly everywhere, so it might be a fight when we get the trans in. One of the other things to notice too that will save you a whole lot of headache is the torque converter is not perfectly concentric, in the sense that these holes aren't equally spaced. So you want to start with the hole that has the 2 square edges, the hole that's a little bit smaller. If you start with this one, that centers the torque converter up in the correct manner to where you can get all 4 of the bolts tightened up in one shoot. So we've got that to where it's at our torque converter inspection cover hole, so we can get a bolt into there right away. I also like to try to rotate the torque converter so that it's sort of in the same realm of where that hole's going to be. Aids in actually getting everything to bolt up. This truck's not too bad. We can still get up and get a hand in where the starter goes to turn the torque converter if necessary, but some modern vehicles, you don't even have a window. You have to do it through the starter hole itself, and there's not a lot of room. So we're lucky in that sense. The next step we need to do is we need to blow the transmission cooler out. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we have flow in both directions. One of the things to take into consideration with that is if this has a thermostatic valve in the transmission cooler lines, it would prevent flow when cold. This vehicle doesn't. So what we're going to do is just take a rubber tipped air nozzle and then some sort of container to collect the fluid in. And we're just going to check for flow in both directions. This also pushes out any old fluid that's in the system. So that direction has pretty good flow. We'll check the other direction. I like to use a clear cup too, because then you can actually see how it's coming out. And we have a cleared cooler in both directions. So that is, as you can see, there's a fair amount of junk that got blown out of there. So it's really important to make sure we clean the cooler out as much as possible. So now we'll get on to through and cleaned out the transmission cooler a little bit more to get all the debris out that we possibly could. You want to make sure, if you try to use solvent to clean this out, that it's okay with the automatic transmission fluid that you're going to use. Inevitably, you're never going to get all of the junk out, even the cleaner out of the line. So you don't want it to adversely affect the clutch discs or anything like that. So our next step is to actually bolt the transmission up into place. So I do have it up as, fairly high, so that we wouldn't have to watch me pump the jack for a half an hour to get it up this high. One of the things that I like to do is I like to line up the dowel pins. And if you see on this transmission, right below the dowel pin is a bolt. So this transmission utilizes 2 special bolts on either side that go right next to the dowel pins, and these are the first 2 that I put in. You want to make sure you start them and you're putting them in by hand. You don't gun one down, because you could risk fracturing the case if the case isn't all the way over the dowel pin. The other thing to take into consideration is making sure wiring like this is out of the way and not going to get jammed in the bell housing in the engine. It's a frequent issue when transmissions come out or when engines come out, that the wiring can get stuck in between, and then you can have an electrical issue result from that. So what you basically want to try to do is you want to try to match the angle of the engine to the angle of the transmission and get the height the correct height. So sometimes this can take a couple goes, especially if you got a lot of wiring in the way. But utilizing the controls on the jack to try to ease it in is the best bet. Okay, so I got my first dowel pin going in, so I'm going to start threading in the bolt that goes right below it to try to keep it in that secure spot and that end from moving. And what you can sometimes do is you can sometimes pivot off that bolt. So I like to put it in a couple threads Again, going in by hand so that we don't run the risk of cross-threading it or cracking the case or anything like that. But this way you can potentially pivot the case slightly to be able to get it to go in, the other side to go in. So now this particular transmission was missing a bell housing bolt. Again, as I brought up, there's 3 different thread type bell housing bolts. There's the 2 dowel pin ones, there's the 4 that go across the top, and there's the 6 that go across the bottom. I was able to find a bolt to replace the top one. I did end up having to weld up this little dipstick tang because dipstick's not available for this particular truck anymore. And it had broken due to the fact that this bolt was missing. So I like to try to get the dipstick in now as well, simply because they can be a bit of a fight depending on how they're routed. This transmission has a fair amount of room around everything, which is nice, but it's still worth doing now. And our transmission strap is in the way. So another good point to bring up now, since I have to remove it, strap the transmission down onto the jack again, just like removal. That way that if anything happens, the transmission will stay on the jack, hopefully, or it'll give you enough time to run. Don't try to catch the transmission. These things are usually a couple 100 pounds. It doesn't matter how strong you are, it's gonna hurt. So if it starts to fall, don't be the hero, just let it hit the ground. Just preserve your body, not the trans that's easily replaceable. Okay, so got that down. All right, so that's in. So then what I'll do now is I'll go through and start putting in all the bell housing bolts, get the 4 top bell housing bolts tight, and then we'll do the torque converter bolts. All right, so then the next step is going to be installing the torque converter bolts. Again, I like to work forward back when I'm going on the install, to where when I'm removing it, it's back forward. That way you don't skip any steps. So we've got the top bell housing bolts, the 2 dowel pin bell housing bolts, all secured, so the transmission's secure. It's not going to go anywhere against the engine. Now we can go through and put the torque converter bolts in, put the inspection plate, starter, and then start working on the electrical and everything to get that all installed. Obviously, if there's components like the dipstick here that have to go in because they utilize one of the bell housing bolts, you need to do that at the same time, but try to do everything in an order so that you're not skipping a step. All right, so now we got all 4 torque converter bolts in, torqued down. Now we'll install the inspection cover and then move on to the starter. All right, our next step is our starter. One of the things to keep note of this is the starter is going to center on the bell housing of the trans with this lip. So again, you want to make sure we get both bolts in and that the starter is completely seated on its bore so that it's down. You don't want to let the starter kind of hang on a bolt. Potentially you can run the risk of having it snap. It's very, very common. This particular vehicle has the separator plate. Some vehicles do have other starter plates that you also need to make sure shims the starter. GM has shims, Ford has shims. All different manufacturers do, but you don't want to try to start a bolt like this. So what you want to make sure you're doing is you want to make sure that you're putting the starter completely flush and torquing it down. That way we know we're not cracking anything. You can get away with tightening it up, but then a lot of times the starter won't engage the flex plate gear, and you can have a strange noise that happens every start. So you want to make sure you're doing that. So then we'll hook up our 12 volt and our solenoid, and then start hooking up all of the electrical that go along with the transmission. All right, so now we're gonna get the transmission cooler lines in. I already put the
two little clips so that they'll be retained. I always like to give it a little wiggle afterwards. You also need to make sure that these dust covers are completely installed. They also, what their other job is they prevent the little clip that we took out to remove these from popping out. Because during vibration with the engine shaking, these can pop out. These little plastic clips will retain that, so that way we know we're not going to have an issue with that. Now we'll start hooking up all the electrical for the transmission. I went through and cleaned out all of the connectors with some electrical contact cleaner to make sure that we wouldn't have any debris when I plugged it straight in. And then that way we know we're getting the circuit completed. We'll also get our shift linkage installed in the bracket but not hooked up, because we're going to hook it up last after our drive shaft is in. So I have the transmission in neutral so we can turn the drive shaft to line it up with the differential. But we will get it clipped in to its home so it's not hanging down out of the way. All right, so I kind of jumped ahead a little bit. I installed the exhaust, cross member, and drive shaft in the reverse order that we took them out. You saw me take them out. Filled the transmission up with fluid and got it up to temperature. Now we'll actually check the transmission fluid level. We need to make sure that it's in between the second dots for it to be warm. So we're in between the second dots. So our next step is we need to clear the variable line pressures and then quick learn the transmission. And we do that through the scan tool. So I have an assistant in the vehicle helping me out with this. All right, can you turn it on, key off? So our first step is we're going to clear the variable line pressures counters. So what this is going to do is basically going to tell the transmission that all the clutch packs are new, so that it will operate as new. All right, can you start it for me? So now that we've done that, we're going to do a quick learn. Quick learn is going to learn all of the clutch CVIs for the input clutches and the braking clutches. What it requires the engine on with an occupant in the vehicle holding their foot on the brake and the parking brake set, and then they're just going to run through the gears. So brake pedal must be pressed, the parking brake set during this quick learn procedure. So meets the criteria. Shift to drive. And this happens quite frequently where the scan tool drops out. Are you in neutral? Okay, it's gonna rev up. Drive. Park. Okay, I always like to do a DTC check beforehand. There's no DTCs. And then we'll double check the CVIs. All right, so 2 forwards at 68, low reverse 42, 118, 48. So yeah, we're actually looking pretty good for CVIs, so we can go ahead and go on a test drive with this. We'll check the fluid level one last time. All right, so our fluid level is good, so now we can go ahead and drive it. All right, want to make sure it goes through all gears. Okay, so it looks like we're good to go. So we'll just double check the fluid level one last time and ship the truck. All right, so after a test drive, we do one last fluid level check in neutral, make sure that everything's at its right level. Yep, trans level's good. So our last step, just double check, make sure there's no codes, finish up the paperwork, and return the vehicle to the customer. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch the video, and hope to see you in the next one.